In 1918, a Canadian family sold the largest automobile company in the country for $8.5 million, on one condition: Canada would keep control. 100 years later, almost to the day, General Motors shut that same factory down. In between, 10,000 workers built a city around it. Taxpayers handed GM $3 billion to save it, and every promise in that original deal is broken. It all started with a carriage-maker's son who saw something in Detroit that changed everything. A century before the gates closed for good, Oshawa was a town built on sawdust and sweat. In 1869, Robert McLaughlin set up shop at the edge of Ontario's farmland, crafting sturdy carriages for a country on the move. The McLaughlin Carriage Works grew from a handful of workers to the largest carriage factory in the British Empire, its floors thick with the dust of cut timber and the clang of iron fittings. By the turn of the 20th century, the streets of Toronto and Halifax echoed with the rumble of McLaughlin wagons, each one a rolling advertisement for Canadian skill. But for Sam McLaughlin, Robert's ambitious son, the future was not in horses. In 1905, Sam crossed the border to Detroit, where a new kind of power was changing everything. Factories there were churning out automobiles, machines that promised to leave the past behind. Sam saw rows of gleaming Buicks, each one powered by an engine more reliable than anything he'd known. He returned to Oshawa determined to leap into this new world, risking his family's fortune on a vision that few Canadians dared to imagine. The gamble took shape in 1907. That spring, Sam struck a deal with William C. Durant, the force behind Buick and soon-to-be founder of General Motors. The contract gave the McLaughlin Company a 15-year license to build cars with Buick powertrains, merging Detroit's cutting-edge engines with Oshawa's hand-built bodies. The first McLaughlin-Buick rolled out of the plant later that year, a fusion of American muscle and Canadian craftsmanship. The factory floor, once lined with carriage wheels, now bristled with steel frames and the hiss of steam presses. A workforce of 150, many retrained from the old carriage days, set about assembling a machine that would soon put Canadian roads on the map. Sam's vision was more than a business bet. It was a declaration that Canada could build its own industrial future. The Oshawa plant expanded from a modest workshop to a sprawling complex, its output growing with each passing year. By the end of the first year, 1,200 McLaughlin Buicks had found their way onto Canadian roads. The partnership with Buick had not only secured the company's survival, it set the stage for an empire. What began in sawdust was now forged in steel, with Sam McLaughlin's Detroit-inspired gamble turning Oshawa into the beating heart of Canada's automotive dream. By 1908, the Oshawa factory pulsed with new energy. The original carriage shop had grown into a sprawling complex, its brick walls stretching across 15 acres, echoing with the clang of steel and the steady rhythm of assembly lines. In that first year alone, 1,200 McLaughlin Buicks rolled out onto Canadian roads, each one a symbol of a country determined to build its own future. The workforce, now 150 strong, was a mix of seasoned carriage builders and young recruits, all learning to shape steel instead of wood. For many, the leap from wagon wheels to automobile frames meant not just a new job, but a new sense of pride. The company's expansion did not stop at the factory gates. To keep up with demand, McLaughlin invested in the community itself. South of the plant, the company laid out neat rows of brick duplexes, each built for just 100 Canadian dollars, a price low enough that even a line worker could dream of home ownership. Streets were paved, utilities installed, and soon a patchwork of tidy lawns and vegetable gardens filled the empty fields. The company also funded a school and a church, turning Oshawa from a rough mill town into a place where families could put down roots. This surge of growth transformed more than the skyline. The plant became a magnet for workers from across Ontario, drawing in families looking for steady pay and a chance at something better. The hum of industry spilled out into the streets, and local businesses thrived on the steady wages flowing from the factory. Every new car that left the line was a promise kept, to the workers, to their families, and to a town that was learning to see itself not as a stop on the rail line, but as the heart of Canada's new industrial age. The prosperity of these years would soon be reflected in the grand ambitions of Sam McLaughlin himself, who was already planning a home that would stand as a monument to what Oshawa had become. During the dry years of Ontario's Prohibition, the McLaughlin name picked up a new kind of fame. The story goes that 6 gleaming McLaughlin-Buick trucks, quick and nearly silent for their day, became the vehicles of choice for local bootleggers. They called them the Whiskey Six. Whether it was fact or just good storytelling, the legend stuck. 6-cylinder engines rumbling through back roads at night, barrels of contraband whiskey tucked in the back, outpacing the constables who could never quite keep up. Newspaper clippings whispered about midnight chases and mysterious trucks, but hard evidence remains buried in the archives, somewhere between folklore and police blotters lost to time. While the streets buzzed with rumors of whiskey runs, Sam McLaughlin was negotiating a different kind of high-stakes deal. On March 28, 1918, he sold the McLaughlin Motor Car Company to General Motors for $8.5 million, a sum that, in those days, could have bought every house on Dale Street and then some. The contract wasn't just about money. It included a promise. Canadian executives would keep their hands on the wheel. The agreement set aside seats for Canadians on the board, guaranteed a share of profits would stay north of the border, and put Sam himself in charge of day-to-day operations. In theory, the heart of the company would keep beating in Oshawa, not Detroit. This autonomy clause was more than fine print. It was a covenant, a reassurance to workers, families, and an entire city that the factory's future would be shaped in Canada. For decades, that promise underpinned a sense of security and pride. The ink on the contract was barely dry before Oshawa's fortunes surged, ushering in years of prosperity that seemed as sturdy as the steel frames rolling out of the plant. But buried in all that optimism was a question. How long could a promise hold once the real power shifted south of the border? By the late 1920s, Oshawa's factories thundered day and night. The assembly lines stretched across the city's north end, drawing in thousands of workers from every corner of Ontario. In 1928, the plant's headcount reached 5,000, a workforce larger than the population of many small towns. This was more than a factory. It was the economic engine of a nation. At its height, the Oshawa plant produced 1 out of every 3 cars sold in Canada. Streets from Vancouver to Halifax filled with McLaughlin-Buicks and Chevrolets, each one stamped with the pride of Canadian hands. Inside the plant, innovation was constant. The old carriage workshops had given way to modern assembly lines, where bodies and engines met with a precision that rivaled Detroit's best. By the 1930s, Oshawa's output kept pace with the world's automotive giants. The Depression years were hard, but the plant never stood still. War brought a new sense of duty, assembly lines retooled for military trucks and armored vehicles, keeping thousands employed while serving a country at war. After 1945, the city surged into a new era. The returning soldiers found jobs waiting, and the post-war boom turned Oshawa into a symbol of Canadian prosperity. Every year, the numbers climbed higher. By 1965, the Oshawa workforce peaked at 10,300, a figure that dwarfed even the Roaring Twenties. The plant's annual output surged to 300,000 vehicles, fueling a supply chain that reached deep into the forests, mines, and steel mills of Ontario. For generations, a job at General Motors meant stability, a house on a quiet street, a pension, a future for your children. The company sponsored hockey teams, built parks, and funded scholarships. In Oshawa, the line between factory and community blurred. Paychecks circulated through every shop and diner, supporting a web of small businesses and family farms. The plant itself was a marvel of its time. New stamping presses arrived from the United States, and Canadian engineers introduced cold weather upgrades that kept engines running through brutal winters. The company invested in research and development, producing models tailored to Canadian roads. Local managers made decisions that shaped the product line, and Canadian executives still held a seat at the table. The promise of autonomy, written into the 1918 sale, seemed secure. For nearly half a century, Oshawa's rhythm set the pace for the entire industry. The city's skyline, dominated by smokestacks and water towers, stood as a monument to what Canadian ambition could achieve. This was the era when a job on the line meant more than a wage. It meant being part of something bigger, a national story of invention, growth, and shared prosperity. The sense of pride ran deep, from the shop floor to the city council. In these years, the idea that the heart of Canada's auto industry could ever falter seemed unthinkable. Yet, beneath the surface, the seeds of future struggle were being planted. For now, though, the hum of the assembly line drowned out any doubts. Oshawa was the beating heart of Canada's car empire, and its pulse was strong. On May 12, 1972, the last link to Oshawa's founding vision was lost. Sam McLaughlin, who had steered the factory from its earliest days of sawdust and steam to the height of the Canadian auto age, died at the age of 100. His passing was more than a family loss. It left a vacuum at the very top of General Motors of Canada, a vacuum Detroit wasted no time filling. In the weeks that followed, the corridors of the Oshawa head office grew tense. Rumors swirled about new leadership, and by the end of June, the changes came fast. On June 28, R.A. McLaughlin, Sam's own son and the company's president, resigned under pressure. Within days, 6 senior Canadian engineers were shown the door. By June 30, a Detroit-based vice president arrived, carrying orders straight from Michigan. The old guard, men who had spent decades building a uniquely Canadian operation, were replaced by executives who answered only to Detroit. The new regime brought policies, not partnerships. Decisions once made in Oshawa now required sign-off from across the border. The numbers told the story. In a single year, the share of Canadian-born senior officers dropped from 62% to just 18%. The autonomy clause, once the backbone of the 1918 agreement, was quietly ignored. Letters of protest landed on the desks of the Ontario Labour Relations Board, filed by union leaders who saw the writing on the wall. The board insisted GM maintain at least 30% Canadian management, but the company pressed ahead. reshaping the executive floor in Detroit's image. For workers on the line, the shift felt immediate. Familiar faces disappeared from the factory floor and the offices above. The sense of community, of a company run by neighbors, for neighbors, gave way to a colder, more distant authority. Local managers now relayed instructions from Michigan, and the old practice of tailoring cars and policies to Canadian needs faded. The plant still hummed, but the decision-making heart had moved south. Sam McLaughlin's absence was felt not only in the boardroom, but in every corner of Oshawa. The man who had once walked the line, who had listened to workers and shaped the city's future, was gone. In his place stood a corporate structure that saw Oshawa as another outpost, not the beating heart of Canadian industry. The promise of the past, of Canadian control and shared prosperity, was replaced by a new reality. The era of local autonomy was over. What followed would test the city's resilience and begin a long, uneasy relationship with the distant power now calling the shots. By the early 1980s, the mood inside the Oshawa plant had changed. Each round of contract talks brought new threats from Detroit: accept wage freezes or face the shutdown of Canada's flagship factory. In 1984, the Canadian auto workers faced down a warning: no concessions, no jobs. The union agreed to a wage freeze, hoping to buy time. But the pattern was set. In 1993, 2,000 workers were laid off. 5 years later, another 1,200 jobs vanished. Each time the company promised stability if workers made sacrifices. Each time the cuts kept coming. Union leaders like Bob White and Buzz Hargrove became household names, leading marches through Oshawa's downtown, waving banners that read, "Keep our plant alive." Meetings with government ministers stretched late into the night. The message from GM never changed. Costs were too high, competition too fierce. Only deep cuts could save the plant. Workers gave ground again and again, trading overtime and future raises for the hope of keeping their jobs. Then came the crash of 2008. As the global financial system buckled, the Canadian government stepped in with a $3 billion bailout for GM. The deal was supposed to guarantee a future for Oshawa. Politicians promised that the plant would not close, that Canadian jobs were safe. But the fine print told a different story. The bailout came with no ironclad guarantee, just a handshake and a press release. GM's internal memos still flagged Oshawa as uncompetitive. For the workers, the rescue felt like déjà vu. Taxpayer money flowed south, but the threats never stopped. Every concession bought only a little more time. The promise of partnership had become a cycle of demands and disappointment, a slow grind that wore down even the most loyal hands on the line. At 9 a.m. on November 26, 2018, the message landed like a hammer blow. General Motors announced the permanent closure of the Oshawa assembly plant, 100 years after the company's original promise to keep Canadian hands on the wheel. The news swept through the city in minutes, carried by texts, radio bulletins, and the stunned silence of workers who had arrived expecting just another shift. Some had given decades to the line. Many came from families whose stories in Oshawa began with the first McLaughlin carriage. By noon, the plant gates became a gathering place. Workers called the union hotline, voices breaking as they tried to process what had been lost. Outside, a crowd formed, men and women in union jackets, retirees with old ID badges, teenagers who had hoped for a job on the line. The city's heartbeat, once measured in the steady churn of stamped steel and rolling engines, now echoed in the quiet disbelief that followed the announcement. Local businesses closed early. Schools lowered their flags. In living rooms across town, families sat together, staring at the television as the story unfolded. The grief found its voice online. Within hours, #Oshawa Never Dies was trending across Canada. Messages poured in from former workers, from other auto towns, from people who remembered what the plant had meant. A promise of stability, a reason to stay. Some shared photos of grandparents in coveralls. Others posted snapshots of the first car they bought, stamped "Made in Oshawa." On December 20th, 2019, the last vehicle rolled off the line. Workers gathered for a final shift, signing their names on the frame, passing around markers and memories. As the doors closed behind them, the weight of a century settled over the city. The promise made in 1918, the pledge that Oshawa would always have a place in the future of Canadian industry, had been broken. What remained was a sense of pride, a sharp ache, and a question that hung in the cold winter air. What does a community built on steel do when the factory falls silent? A century ago, Canada traded its automotive future for a promise of control, only to watch that promise dissolve in a boardroom far from Oshawa. Today, the empty factory stands as proof that national ambition can be bought, but not safeguarded. As new industries rise, the lesson remains. Foreign stewardship rarely preserves local legacy. What's built with pride can vanish with a signature. Share your thoughts below.